From David Cronenberg's The Fly to Marvel's The Incredible Hulk, fiction is packed with scientists pushing limits and paying the price. But the real world has its own catalog of experiments that spiraled out of control, with consequences far more chilling than anything on a movie screen.
He was trying to make history and it wasn't working.
These aren't scenes from a script. These are actual moments when scientific ambition backfired in ways no one saw coming. These are 15 science experiments that went horribly wrong.
The case of MKUltra has to be one of the craziest cases of blowback in CIA history, because here they took this drug, LSD, and thought that they were going to be able to use it to control people's minds.
Number 15. The Boy Who Became Brenda.
Janet Reimer sees the smile on her son David's face, but she knows what it's hiding. A painful lie, a lie that haunted him, ultimately to his death.
When Bruce Reimer turned 8 months old, a simple circumcision went wrong and left his penis badly damaged. His family, hoping to fix the damage, sought guidance from psychologist John Money. Money was sure he could turn Bruce into a girl. Without thinking about Bruce's own feelings, Money and Bruce's doctors went ahead with sex reassignment surgery. Bruce was renamed Brenda, and his twin brother Brian stayed a boy. From that day on, the adults around Brenda forced her to live as a girl. Money declared this a great success and used Brenda's case to back his idea that gender is all learned, not felt inside.
We've been stereotyped in our view of male and female.
But Brenda never felt like a girl. She told the adults, yet they pressed on. As she grew, Brenda battled deep confusion. At age 14, she learned the truth, that she was born male.
I tried with the makeup, and it turned out to be a disaster. I mean, you got the red circles on the cheeks, and I look like a clown, basically.
With the secret out, Brenda began living as a boy again. He chose a new name, David. Yet the surgeries and the years of living a false role left scars. David fell into a dark depression. He saw how many other children were cut and changed without choice. He spoke out and joined a research paper that revealed how wrong the experiment was. The world finally took notice. Despite his bravery, the pain ran deep. At 38, David could not bear the weight and took his own life.
The final chapters of David Reimer's latest book are left unfinished. His conflicted life cut short last week by a tragic suicide.
David Reimer's story stands as a stark warning. Forcing someone into a body that doesn't fit can break their spirit. Every child deserves a life guided by who they really feel inside, not by a scientist's guess. Number 14. Franz Reichelt's Suit Tumble. Franz Reichelt loved to tinker and dream big. In the early 1900s, he sewed together 320 square feet of cloth into what he called a wearable parachute suit. He tested it by dropping weighted dummies off low rooftops, but each dummy slammed to the ground before the suit could open its fold. Reichelt blamed the short drop and insisted only a fall from much higher up could prove his idea. On a gray morning in 1912, cameras and a growing crowd gathered on the second platform of the Eiffel Tower. Reichelt arrived wearing a heavy coat lined with fabric wings and ropes. He beamed at curious onlookers, shouting that his suit would billow like a giant fan and save his life. Then he took a deep breath and stepped off the ledge. For a heartbeat, the suit held its shape like a sloppy wing. Then it collapsed like a cloth flag in still air. Reichelt fell straight down. Witnesses gasped as he hit the ground with a shocking crash. Some say he went out from the first blow, while others claim a heart attack struck during the fall. Either way, his invention never got a second chance. The accident stunned Paris and the early flying community. Inventors learned that no matter how clever the design, every new safety device needed careful tests. Wind tunnels, scale dummies, and staged trials became the norm. Reichelt's bold leap ended a daring chapter in flight history and taught a vital lesson. Human life should never be the first test. Reichelt's fall sparked new safety rules and inspired engineers to carry out careful, small tests. Today, photographs of the moment sit in history books as a solemn warning. They remind us that big dreams must meet solid proof before risking a life. Number 13. Phantom Wind Chase. In the late 1800s, many scientists believed space was filled with an unseen substance called ether. They thought light traveled by rippling through this ether, just like waves move on water.
This magical medium that was hypothesized to be what light required to move through the vacuum of space, just the way sound requires air to move from one place to another.
Since Earth orbits the sun, they said it should feel an ether wind. That wind would make light change speed depending on which way you pointed it. To find that breeze, physicist Albert Michelson built a clever tool called an interferometer. This tool splits a beam of light into two at right angles. Mirrors sent each beam back to join again, creating a pattern of light and dark lines. If Earth moved through ether, one beam would lag behind the other, shifting the pattern. In 1887, Michelson and his partner Edward Morley set the device on a heavy stone slab in a windproof basement at Case Western Reserve University. They ran trial after trial at different times of day and in different seasons, checking for any change in the lines. Every single test showed no change, no shift, no hint of an ether breeze. The beams matched exactly, no matter how they turned the instrument. After many months, Michelson and Morley had to admit they did not find what they expected. The ether they chased simply did not exist. At first, that completely empty finding felt like a failure, but that empty finding pointed the way to a bold idea. The speed of light is the same for everyone, everywhere. In 1905, a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein used this lesson to create his theory of special relativity. That theory tossed out absolute space and time and gave us E equals mc squared, changing how we view the universe. Number 11. Wilhelm Reich's Cloudbusters. Wilhelm Reich believed our bodies and the sky shared a secret, a mysterious energy he named orgone.
And Reich was the first person to introduce breathing into psychoanalytic therapy.
Nobody talks about breathing the way Reich talks about it.
Inspired by Freud's work on desire, he thought orgone powered everything, from plants to the weather to the color of the sky. He believed a good orgasm released this power, and that gathering orgone could heal mental illness and even cancer. His peers thought he was crazy. After all, orgone sounded like something out of a sci-fi novel. In the late 1950s, Reich grew convinced that aliens were zapping Earth with special rays to block our orgone supply. To fight back, he and his son built rows of metal tubes, known as cloudbusters, and pointed them skyward. They dipped hoses into buckets of water, thinking the water would draw in the harmful rays. On some days, they claimed clouds would break up, rain would fall, or storms would calm. But no one ran strict tests to prove the effects. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration labeled Reich's machines a danger. In 1954, they seized his gear and ordered him to destroy it, saying he was selling false hopes. Reich refused and tried to move the machines across state lines. That effort led to his arrest and a jail sentence. He died behind bars in 1957. Decades later, hobbyists still build weather machines in fringe labs. Reich's cloud-busting shows that without clear proof, bold ideas can lead to public outcry, legal trouble, and lost trust. Number 10. Stanford Prison Experiment. In August 1971, researchers at Stanford University turned a campus basement into a fake prison. They picked 24 healthy college students from over 70 volunteers and paid each $15 a day. Half were randomly named guards and given mirrored sunglasses, uniforms, and batons, but told not to hit anyone. The other half were prisoners, arrested by real cops, stripped of their clothes, dressed in smocks, and shackled at the ankle with a heavy lock. On day 2, prisoners tore off their smocks in protest. Guards broke it up with threats of solitary cool-down time and took away meals. They invented punishments: push-ups for talking back, sleep breaks revoked for minor rule breaks. Within 4 days, 3 prisoners were so shaken that they left. Some guards grew cruel without orders, shouting insults, forcing head counts at all hours, even waking prisoners at 2 a.m. "You feel your own guard within you," one guard later said, describing how the experiment blurred his sense of self. Philip Zimbardo, the lead researcher, played the jail superintendent so well that he lost sight of his role as a scientist. He watched through one-way mirrors and cameras as the prison world spun out of control. On the 6th day, his girlfriend and an outside colleague objected to the harm they saw. Zimbardo pulled the plug, 8 days before the planned end. The fallout was huge. Critics pointed out the setup encouraged drama. Advertisements may have attracted tough guy types, and guards knew they were in a show. 2 decades later, the BBC ran a fresh jail study where subjects resisted unfair rules, suggesting Zimbardo's team shaped their own story. Still, the Stanford prison experiment left a mark on how we see power, roles, and the thin line between order and abuse. Number 9. Guatemala syphilis experiments. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. health officials ran a secret study in Guatemala City to learn exactly how syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid spread, and how penicillin might stop them. Led by Dr. John C. Cutler of the U.S. Public Health Service, teams worked with Guatemala's National Hygiene Laboratory and the Pan American Sanitary Bureau. In all, about 1,300 people, prisoners, soldiers, mental hospital patients, orphans, and sex workers, were enrolled without ever giving their permission. Doctors infected people in brutal ways. Some prisoners were ordered to have unprotected sex with prostitutes already carrying the diseases. In mental hospitals, nurses scraped the skin of patients and rubbed bacteria into the scratches. In other cases, the disease was injected right into the spinal fluid with a needle. Soldiers at a nearby base volunteered, but didn't know they were being infected. Even young boys in an orphanage were part of the tests. Once infected, only around 700 victims ever got penicillin. The rest suffered terrible sores in their genitals, rashes on their bodies, fevers, and bone pain that sometimes left them unable to walk. By 1953, at least 83 people had died from these infections. All of this took place without any review by an ethics board, decades before modern rules made informed consent a must for human studies. The experiment stayed under wraps until 2005, when historian Susan M. Reverby uncovered old files at Wellesley College. Public outrage grew fast. In 2010, President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton formally apologized to Guatemala's then-President Alvaro Colom. Senator Blanche Lincoln called the events shameful, and Congress held hearings on how such abuses could happen. Victims and their families sued in U.S. courts, asking for compensation. Although the government refused to pay damages, the case helped spark stronger laws on human research. Number 8. Winthrop Kelloggs' ape experiment. In 1931, psychologist Winthrop N. Kellogg moved his family from Bloomington, Indiana, to a small farmhouse in West Orange, New Jersey, to conduct a bold experiment. He brought home a 3-month-old female chimpanzee named Gua and set her beside his 4-month-old son, Donald. Each day, they ate from matching bowls, played with identical wooden blocks, and even wore the same blanket when they napped. Kellogg, a pioneer of early child psychology, recorded more than 10,000 observations over 9 months, tracking heart rate responses to sudden sounds, testing fine motor skills with puzzle boxes, measuring grasp strength with spring scales, and speaking simple words before a wax cylinder recorder. To his surprise, Gua mastered block stacking faster than Donald, and she learned to respond to her own name after just 1 week, while Donald took twice as long. But milestones began to diverge when the children reached 6 months. Gua could not form the vocal sounds needed to say mama, and her memory test stalled at 3 items, while Donald kept improving. Even more startling, Donald began to imitate Gua's chimp-like hoots and her leaf-smacking gestures. Worried that their son might learn ape behaviors and that Gua's growing strength might endanger the baby, the Kelloggs ended the study in November 1931. they sent Gua to the Jackson Primate Center in Florida, where she still sipped from baby bottles and peeked at visitors through her cage bars. Sadly, Gua caught pneumonia and died in October 1933, aged 3. The Kelloggs published The Ape and the Child in 1933, sparking debates about the limits of animal learning and the ethics of raising wild animals in human homes. Their work laid the groundwork for modern studies in language development, animal cognition, and the strict rules that now govern research with primates. Number 7. Clarence Delis radiation poisoning. Born in 1865 in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, Clarence Madison Delis joined Edison's Menlo Park lab in 1883. His skill at shaping glass walls made him vital when Edison began exploring X-rays, a ray that passed through skin and lit a screen. By 1896, Delis had designed the first high-vacuum tubes used at Edison's West Orange lab. He stood in front of crowds, placing his bare hands in the beam to show how bones and metal appeared white on a screen. At first, Delis felt no harm, only bright glows on his skin. Within a year, red spots formed on his fingers, and cuts stopped healing. Wilhelm Röntgen had warned that long exposure might damage living tissue, but no safety gear existed then. By late 1897, surgeons had removed Delis' right index finger and thumb. Edison wrote in his notes, "Increase distance." Yet Delis refused to slow down and kept detailed records of his wounds. He sent photographs of his ulcers to Dr. James Ewing at Columbia, who reported serious cell damage. In April 1903, Edison agreed to amputate both of Delis' arms below the elbows. His face was tinted by broken blood vessels, and his breathing worsened as lung tissue was damaged. Delis once quipped, "I wish I had a lead coat, but none existed." After seeking advice from European doctors in early 1904, he returned to New York frail and exhausted. On November 2, 1904, at age 39, Clarence Delis died from radiation poisoning, the first known fatality from X-ray overexposure. Edison, stricken by the loss, abandoned X-ray work that same year. Delis' case prompted the American Roentgen Ray Society to set its first safety rules in 1909. Number 6. The MK-Ultra. In 1953, the CIA poured 10 kilograms of pure LSD into a top-secret program called MK-Ultra. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the agency's mad scientist, sent undercover agent George Hunter White to set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York. White stocked them with free booze and hired women to bring in clients. Behind one-way mirrors, he watched as unsuspecting visitors drank martinis, got dosed with acid, and writhed in panic or floated in bliss, all without knowing a thing. MK-Ultra was more than a drug trial. It was a quest for mind control. Between 1953 and 1964, the CIA funded at least 149 secret projects at 80 institutions, from Harvard to Canada's McGill University. They tested hypnosis, sensory deprivation, LSD, and even electroshock therapy on prisoners, hospital patients, and soldiers. At Fort Bragg, officers were dosed in the mess hall. In New York's Willowbrook State School, children with developmental disabilities got zapped with high-voltage currents. One of the worst cases was Frank Olson, a biochemist who, after a secret LSD dose in 1953, died under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled a suicide, but still debated today. By the late 1960s, stories of flashbacks, suicidal breakdowns, and brain damage reached Congress. In 1975, the Church Committee forced the CIA to admit MK-Ultra existed. Most files had already been shredded, but survivors' lawsuits and declassified memos revealed the truth. Thousands of people were used as guinea pigs. The experiments cost over $3 million and left deep scars on families and careers. In trying to create super-obedient spies, the CIA opened a Pandora's box. LSD slipped quietly into underground clubs and college campuses, fueling the counterculture movement they'd hoped to crush. The very drug meant to control minds ended up freeing them and teaching a brutal lesson. You can't lock someone in a mental cage without breaking something valuable and human inside. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. The basement lights flickered as Dr. Mira Chen flipped through the charred pages of her journal, her fingers trembling. Alarms had stopped hours ago, along with the screaming. Of the 15 science experiments she and her team had conducted, one was meant to cure disease, another to reverse aging, and one had simply been a test of sound frequencies on jellyfish. But the outcomes were never what they expected. Mira stared at the blood-stained wall where someone had scrawled in chemical marker, 15 science experiments that went horribly wrong. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was a warning. The plant hybrid they'd engineered for oxygen production had developed a taste for calcium. The invisibility serum didn't wear off. No one had seen Marcus since Wednesday. She backed away from the tanks. One was empty. Again. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, wet and uneven. Mira pressed herself against the door, whispering a quiet apology to her team, to the world. She'd wanted to change everything. And she had. Just not in the way anyone would survive to write about. The last entry in her journal was dated today, and it was still being written by something with too many hands. Number 5. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service ran what it called the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. In Macon County, Alabama, 600 poor black men signed up for free health checks. 400 had syphilis, 200 did not. None were told the real disease name. Instead, doctors blamed their aches and rashes on bad blood and handed out placebo pills, iron tonics, and even aspirin. When penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1947, study leaders refused to treat these men. They worried that giving penicillin would ruin 40 years of data. Year after year, blood tests and spinal taps continued, often without proper consent. Dr. Taliaferro Clark and his team promised life insurance and medical care, drawing the men in with free meals and bus rides. In reality, these incentives masked a study that robbed men of their right to health and honesty. Local hospitals and black community leaders helped recruit participants, trusting public health officials who kept the true purpose under wraps. By the end, at least 28 participants died directly from syphilis. 100 more died from related diseases like heart failure, and dozens of wives and children caught the illness. 19 babies were born with congenital syphilis. It took a whistleblower and a 1972 Associated Press expose to end the study. Public outrage led Congress to pass the National Research Act in 1947, which established clear ethical rules for human trials. In 1973, survivors won a $10 million settlement and lifetime medical benefits. In 1997, President Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the nation. Number 4. Project Cirrus. In 1947, a group of scientists tried to play God with a hurricane, and it didn't end well. The experiment, known as Project Cirrus, was run by General Electric and the U.S. military. Their goal? To weaken hurricanes by flying into them and dropping massive amounts of dry ice into the storm clouds. The theory was that the ice would trigger a reaction in the storm structure, possibly causing it to fall apart or at least lose strength. It sounded bold. On October 13, 1947, a B-17 bomber and a B-29 aircraft took off from Mobile, Alabama, loaded with 180 pounds of crushed dry ice. The target was Hurricane King, which had already grazed Florida and was heading back out to sea. The planes flew directly into the outer edge of the storm and dumped their icy cargo into the eye wall. At first, it looked like nothing had happened. The hurricane was expected to keep heading northeast into the Atlantic, but then it did something strange. It turned sharply and started moving toward the Georgia coast. The storm made landfall near Savannah and barreled into South Carolina, causing widespread destruction. Over $2 million in property damage was reported, along with the death of at least one person. Locals were furious. Many believed that the scientists had made the storm worse or even caused it to change direction. Lawsuits were filed against General Electric, though they were eventually dropped due to a lack of hard proof. But the controversy forced the government to rethink weather modification efforts, at least for a while. Later analysis suggested the hurricane might have already been changing course before the dry ice drop. But the incident raised a serious ethical question. Even if the intent is good, should scientists tamper with forces they don't fully understand? Number 3. The Aversion Project. During South Africa's apartheid era, a bizarre and brutal policy took root in the military, one that claimed to treat homosexuality through psychological and physical torture. This wasn't just misguided science, it was a sanctioned human rights disaster. The South African Defense Force operated under a strange double standard. While permanent military members were banned from being homosexual, conscripts, young white men forced into service, were treated with a dangerous tolerance. Why the contradiction? Officials feared that if homosexuality were completely banned, men would falsely claim to be gay just to avoid conscription. Their solution? Let conscripts serve, then cure them through forced therapy. Between 1971 and 1989, under a program now known as the Aversion Project, military psychiatrists, led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, subjected hundreds of conscripts to horrific treatments. These weren't fringe methods. They were backed by mainstream psychiatric theory of the time, with homosexuality still labeled a mental illness in the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic guide. The therapy included electroshock conditioning. Soldiers were strapped with electrodes and shown erotic images of men. If they showed any sexual arousal, they were shocked. As sessions went on, the voltage increased, a crude attempt to make them associate same-sex attraction with pain. But when that didn't work, and it usually didn't, the next step was worse: involuntary sex reassignment surgeries. Up to 900 young men were subjected to genital modification without consent. New birth certificates were issued, identities were altered, and soldiers were discharged, often halfway through the transformation process. There was no follow-up care, no access to hormone therapy, and no mental health support. Many lived in isolation, rejected by both the state and their families. Dr. Levin and over 20 other medical professionals were eventually condemned by South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission for severe human rights violations. Levin later emigrated to Canada, where he continued practicing psychiatry until being arrested and convicted in 2013 for sexually assaulting male patients. The Aversion Project wasn't just unethical science, it was state-sponsored torture, masquerading as medicine. It left behind a trail of broken lives and a chilling reminder of how easily science can be twisted to serve ideology. Number 2. The Prison Radiation Scandal. In one of the darkest chapters of Cold War science, dozens of prison inmates in Washington and Oregon were subjected to high-dose radiation directly to their testicles, all in the name of research. The goal was to determine the amount of radiation that would render a man sterile, but it wasn't astronauts or nuclear workers being zapped. It was incarcerated men lured in with vague promises of early parole and a measly $100. The experiments were run during the 1960s and 70s, a time when the US government was throwing massive resources into nuclear research. As part of a partnership between the Atomic Energy Commission and university researchers, inmates were offered $5 a month for their participation, with the promise of a vasectomy at the end. Subjects were blasted with up to 600 rads of radiation, equivalent to over 3,000 chest X-rays. Many of these inmates were not properly informed of the risks, nor did they give true informed consent. The long-term effects were devastating: cancer, infertility, chronic illness, and psychological trauma. Worse still, some men didn't even receive the promised follow-up care. The tests were approved and overseen by top universities, including the University of Washington, which justified them with claims of national interest. Officials said they were trying to assess whether radiation from space or nuclear plants could damage male reproductive systems. Yet the fact remains: these men were exploited, reduced to test subjects without regard for their humanity. By the 1990s, public outcry and lawsuits forced official apologies and some compensation. But for the victims, it was far too little, far too late. Number 1. The Mgrim Experiment. In 1961, just months after the world watched the televised trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram asked a disturbing question. Could the horrors of the Holocaust have been carried out by ordinary people simply obeying authority? To test this, Milgram created what would become one of psychology's most infamous experiments. Participants believed they were part of a memory and learning study. Each was assigned the role of teacher and told to administer electric shocks to a learner, actually an actor in the experiment, whenever a question was answered incorrectly. The shock generator was fake, but the participant didn't know that. It was labeled from 15 volts up to 450 volts, marked with a chilling XXX, as the learner faked screams, begged for the test to stop, or even went completely silent. Many participants still kept pressing the button when prompted by the white-coated experimenter. Milgram's results stunned the world. 65% of participants went all the way to the highest voltage, despite believing they were seriously harming another person. Every single one made it to at least 300 volts. The only real force behind their actions was a calm voice that said, "The experiment requires that you continue." Critics slammed the study for emotional trauma inflicted on the participants, some of whom believed they had truly hurt someone. But the experiment's impact was undeniable. It showed that everyday people, under the right circumstances, could become agents of harm, not because they wanted to, but because they were told to. Milgram's findings still ripple through psychology, ethics, and law enforcement today. Whether in the military, the workplace, or history's darkest moments, the question lingers. How far will someone go if they think they're just doing what they're told? At what point does the pursuit of knowledge stop being progress and start becoming something much more dangerous? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.